We are back and things are starting to move in the right direction, you would think, based on the optics, at least, of Memorial Day weekend. So, why not start from there as we saw video from all over the country, people out and about. Now, granted, everybody is still outside in some capacity, it's not jammed into an indoor building, but just let's start with your reaction and kind of the medical community's reaction to people just out and about anywhere from nightclubs in Houston to beaches in Maryland and Jersey and Florida, and just treating it felt like, watching the videos at least, that Memorial Day weekend, even if it's just a small portion of people being out, felt like nothing ever even happened.
Yeah, a very good point. I think that looking at the news media, at least in terms of pockets of areas, whether it be in the Ozarks or other places where people gathering either during Memorial Day weekend or even before, um, from the point of the medical community, this is anxiety raising. There's no question about that. We are anxious that people are not cautious in terms of not just the gathering, but the fact that they're not adhering to the distancing that's recommended. And in these gatherings where it's maybe impossible to have distance, that the recommendation is that masks be used. And you could see again that a lot of people didn't even adhere to that. So there is a sense of anxiety amongst the medical community that we're going to be seeing more of these individuals coming in with illness. Less anxious about a huge onslaught the way we had the surges, but because this is a virus that carries with it significant mortality and morbidity, I think that in general we would like to see a little more restraint. Now, at the same time, we understand human nature. Being locked up and locked down for weeks on end is not a healthy situation either. In addition to that, we understand that people who have lost income also are looking and feeling very torn about whether it's the risk of the infection versus the risk of, again, no income and everything that goes along with that. So there's understanding on both ends of it, but still the anxiety is there.
Well, in looking at maybe a positive or any benefit that could come with this, one thing that we have not done in this country, and granted, it's worked some places as you've laid out, it's worked in some capacity in other places, and it's not worked in other places around the world. So it all depends on the society and the area, I guess, as well, maybe population density. But how is there any positive that can come from this, knowing that the virus, although it does carry a mortality rate, as you mentioned, does have a high percentage of people who are asymptomatic? Is there a possibility that we could have at least began a herd immunity process, even unknowingly?
That's very possible. So far, the indications are that the virus is confusing in terms of understanding its aftermath, meaning what happens to the individual after infection, whether the immunity actually is there, is it long lasting, and for how long. So we're still sort of in the dark. Um, there's no question that there is a large number of asymptomatic people who have had contracted the virus and did not get sick. The question, of course, is why, and the second question, of course, is how long, if there is immunity, how long it would last. And I think that we're still unclear as to the behavior of this virus. So looking at from a point of view, as you mentioned, in terms of a positive, it may be positive, but again, I don't think that we can definitively say at this point where we are with immunity or herd immunity.
So one thing that we don't get on reports, and I'll use a specific one, there was something that came out on North Carolina. So I read the headline that said North Carolina reopens, spike in cases, but nothing determined in the article how severe the cases were, how centralized the amount of people who tested positive could be in nursing home or nursing homes, areas like that. So I do wonder, and this feeds into sports as well later on down the line when they do return in team capacity. But I wonder now if, in fact, an area opens up, but you get a spike in cases who are 95 to 96% asymptomatic. Is that necessary? Is that truly a bad? On the surface, clearly, we're going to see a spike in cases, but knowing what we know, even if it's limited about this virus, is that truly a bad thing?
Again, looking at it from a point of view of bad and good, then having somebody develop immunity or having the individual develop an asymptomatic is complex because the big question, of course, if you're asymptomatic, you are walking around, and if you're a carrier, you're actually spreading the disease to other individuals who may not be asymptomatic and may not have a minor cold. To sort of blanket it and say that it's just great to have more and more individuals exposed and then be asymptomatic, but yet have some sort of immunity is okay. The difference, of course, is how many of these individuals end up being just carriers and can infect more individuals who, again, cannot tolerate the infection. So I think it's a complex issue. I think that this, as I mentioned last time we spoke, this is not over yet.
Right.
And I think that throwing out all of the protective activities that we have in one shot is probably dangerous and may end up, again, costing lives. Now, it may not be at the same rate as we've seen in the past, but any life that could be possibly protected and is not protected is very hard to justify. Now,
I'm sorry.
go ahead. No.
What's the counter to that then? So let's say, for example, we have a situation here in Philadelphia where 250 people were gathering outdoors in a parking lot. Now, it was in the city limits, which is probably the strictest of all of the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders in the state by a mile. And the mayor is threatening, well, now these people might have ruined it for the rest of us, and now you may have to stay at home for another month as a result of that. I know that seems extreme from a political, social standpoint, but is it from a medical standpoint?
Well, there's a whole issue around collective punishment, and I'm not really sure that that's an effective way of approaching it. I think that if there are going to be any gatherings, that if you can sustain social distancing, that should be there. And if you can't, I think, again, adhering to mask wearing is probably your best bet. Now, if that social gathering can be postponed at this point, I think people still favor it. If the need is there and you don't want to postpone it, then again, try to use whatever we know that's somewhat protective. It doesn't mean it's going to eliminate any risk, but it could reduce transmission in a gathering like that. So I think that that's what should be the call by the political leaders, is not necessarily punishing the rest of us, meaning you can't go out now because a few people went out, but to say, again, please remember, and maybe even try to enforce it where you have a gathering like that for people to, again, use the current protective measures. It's a this is going to be a lot of push and pull between human behavior and the need to change the way we approach gatherings at this point. The airlines, which are clearly suffering from a reduction in the number of passengers, and their business is clearly not doing very well under the circumstances. But when you get on a flight today, it's mandatory that you fly with a mask, doesn't matter how long, and that there is, quote unquote, the effect of social distancing, which is against empty seats in between passengers who are not traveling together. I think that if you're going to have any kind of sport event, you may want to borrow some of these activities in terms of risk reduction, meaning mandatory masks and also some kind of distancing in terms of the seats. So you may not be able to fill a stadium, but I think that from a sports event point, any number of fans that could be present, it makes a very big difference as compared to just empty seats all throughout the stadium.
Well, we saw now almost a week now into it, 10 days, it feels like ago, where NASCAR opened up the Ace Speedway and that sucker was packed. No masks, no social distancing, people just lining rows and rows of benches. And I know, as you mentioned from the beginning, it gives the medical community anxiety, but I feel like sports, especially as we get deeper into the summer and back again into the beginning of the fall, sports, it's almost going to be people are going to be looking around saying, what's taking you so long? Because so many people, medically right or wrong, are just going to be out and about. I don't know how you put that Memorial Day weekend back into a bottle when it's already out and human beings have already in this country just said, screw it, I'm going to the club, I'm going to the beach, I'm doing whatever I want.
Look, we all want to be able to go to the club. We all want to go out to the restaurants. We all want to do all these things. And it's going to be very difficult, as you said, to put the toothpaste back in in the tube. We can't do that. But at the same time, I don't think that we should abandon a call for, again, social distancing when possible, if not, again, wearing masks. So uh, we could fight the human nature but as you mentioned before, in terms of political leaders saying we're going to punish everybody by saying you behave poorly on Sunday, therefore the rest of the week you can't go out. I don't think that that's going to work either, but I do think that making sure that we can demonstrate some restraint and yet increase the activities, meaning the outdoor activities, including sports, I think people would like that.
Yeah.
I think that if what happens is that you have a sport event and then a week or two later, there is a huge surge of ill individuals. There's clearly an issue of liability on one side, but also I think that it demonstrates that the anxiety of the medical community is warranted under those circumstances. So, we could say, I think I mentioned this to you before, which is that if something is risky and you take the risk and nothing happens, it doesn't mean that it's not risky. It just means that you were lucky at that point that you didn't get something. So, which is very different than something that's risky. You take all the precautions that are available and nothing happens. It may not be all due to the precautions, but at least you know that if you do this repeatedly and there's a number of events, that the risk clearly is reduced by precautions versus just looking for luck.
So let's look at this. We could end with this as far as the sense of optimism coupled with any data science that says it's okay. And I know that a lot of people over the weekend took it to an extreme about it's okay to return to some sense of normalcy. And they just took it as it's okay to return to normal.
Right.
But clearly, it can't just be a governor or a mayor saying, I'm going to lose the next election if I don't let people out. There has to be some foundation of data that would say it's okay to return to 25%, 40%, 50% of normalcy, knowing, of course, that the extreme that happened over the weekend is not ideal.
The stepwise, as recommended by the White House for opening, there are steps to open, life activities. I I think that, again, we should adhere to a national plan. I think that doing it haphazard is probably it's going to create a lot of tension between states. You could see now with North Carolina saying that the Republican convention is in question, and other states stepping up and saying, well, bring them over to us. I think that these type of activities create more tension and may actually undermine the stepwise approach to opening things. You open the spigot, meaning you just turn everything back on. We do see increase in the number of people who are seriously infected coming to hospitals. Not at the same rate that we've seen before, but there is no doubt that that will happen. And the question is, doing it stepwise and in a concerted effort to reduce risk will diminish those numbers. It's very hard to answer, but why take the risks at this point when we've suffered the most already in the past? I mean, our economy, people being locked down at home, we've passed the worst part of it. So let's just take it slowly and maintain whatever risk reduction we can. Unfortunately, if there is a big event and no one gets infected, I don't know that you could use that to make the judgment that tomorrow we open everything and nothing will happen. I don't think that's going to be the case. The medical community per se, I think, understands more in terms of when patients come in for care than the whole public health issue of reducing the risk. And the concern we have is not just for the people who are coming in sick, but keep in mind that every time somebody who's sick comes into the hospital, it also threatens the medical community in terms of infection. So again, the message that we have is open up, do it stepwise, make sure that you can adhere to at least social distancing, and if you can't, try to minimize transmission by mask. It is not over. We're seeing many countries around the globe opening up, some successfully and some not so successfully. And then we see the countries that adhere to no risks, such as Brazil, and you could see that, and Mexico, where the adherence is very, very low. And there's this virus is just stomping out lives continuously. So being cavalier probably is not going to be the best way of addressing this.